Mendingan enggak? Mukanya pucat. Siapin lagi masih kecil itu. Mami, mami, nanti habis kalian ambil curugnya. Ada di sini, deh.
Di live stream. Waduh, di live stream.
Kenapa?
Ya.
Hello? Hello? Acil? Acil? Hello, hello? 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 Bu Song, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, good then. Okay, shall we start the lecture?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Good day, everyone. Good day, students. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Peace
Waalaikumsalam
be,
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
yeah. Peace be upon us. Today, as what we have already shared in the classes, we're going to have a class, yeah, with Professor Shusong. Yeah, Professor Susong will talk about Indonesia-China bilateral relations. Yeah, what can be learned on the relations between these two countries? Yeah, then I think that her lectures will focus on the current developments, yeah, progress on the Indonesian and China relation. As you may know that, China is the third largest partners of Indonesian government, yeah, and of course there are many issues that are interested to talk about. Busong, today we have students from regular and international class, and yeah, some they are first year, some they are third year. Yeah, and also student, I'm gonna give you a brief information about Susong, or I call her Busong. Yeah, Busong is fluent in of course in English and also in Bahasa. Yeah, because she did her undergraduate, yeah, in Indonesian language from the Peking University, and she did a PhD from International Relations. Yeah, the subject from Tsinghua University, and now she and now she is working as a professor at Center for China's Relation with the neighboring countries at Fudan Universities. So from this, from the background or the institution that he had conducted her study, we can see that uh, she's really a prominent scholar, so that it's a good chance to listen from her perspectives about the current subject that we're going to have today. So without extending the time, Bu Song, you can give your lectures. Yeah, around 30 minutes, 40 minutes, then we will continue to Q&A session. And one last thing, Bu Song, actually, Kajur, the head of department, Pak Zain, the director of international program, would like to attend, wants to attend this program. I think that they are still have a meeting, so maybe I think later they will join. Yeah, this lectures. Thank you, Busong. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bailey. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm very happy to see you online, students. So Bailey is currently visiting Fudan University as a fellow in my center, the Center for China's relations with neighboring countries. And he's the first Indonesian visiting scholar in our center. And his coming has brought a lot of new knowledge, especially about Indonesia, to our circle of scholars. And a few days ago, he gave a very insightful lecture about the Belt and Road Initiative projects in Indonesia, and me and a lot of other students and faculties have learned a lot from his sharing. So today, as a reciprocity, I will give this lecture to students and talk about the China-Indonesia relations. And so, Barry, isn't share slides? Have a slide. I need
Acil,
information to
bisa
share
di
the
ini?
slide.
Oh ya ya ya. Acil. Wait, Bu. Bu Song. Acil, bisa desain jadi co-host Bu Songnya? Yeah, done, Bu. Can you check?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I think you can see the slides here, right? It's all right. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Okay.
see.
Okay. Yeah, great. So today I'm going to share a bit about China-Indonesia bilateral relations and what can be learned. So this lecture is based on a paper that I published in 2020. So that was the anniversary, the 70th anniversary of China-Indonesia diplomatic relations. And I mostly base this paper on the analysis of histories instead of the current China-Indonesia relations dynamics. So I think looking back from right now, looking back like 70 years ago, is very important for us to grasp the basic logic and the mechanism which kind of determines the China-Indonesia relations. I think look at the history is very important. So I'm going to touch upon three issues. The first one is the analytical framework for China-Indonesia relations. And the secondly, I will briefly review the bilateral diplomatic relations. And the third is the summary, to answer the question, what can be learned from the bilateral relations. So firstly, I'll give a brief theoretical review of the analytical framework for China-Indonesia relations. So China and Indonesia has established their diplomatic relations in 1950 and froze diplomatic relations in 1967 and then normalized their relations in 1990. So, and then they became strategic partners in 2005, and then upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2013. And now Indonesia is a partner country of the Belt and Road Initiative and also a founding member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But at the same time, it has Indonesia has a lot of differences or contradictions with China in South China Sea, in their affairs of trade and commerce, and also sometimes there are some misunderstandings in religion and human rights issues such as that. So how do we understand the dynamics behind this changing relationship, and which has gone through many ups and downs? So previously, I think the existing studies have examined the dynamics of Sino-Indonesian relations from three traditions of analysis. So firstly, based on the realist tradition of international relation theory, and especially taking the post-Cold War response of Southeast Asian countries to changes in the regional order as overall context for academic inquiry. A large number of studies have been produced in the last decade or so to use the concept of soft balancing or hedging as the core concepts to explore Indonesia's regional strategy and its response to the foreign policy adjustments of China and the United States. So some typical work include Evelyn Gall's article and also Shambal's article that if you're interested later, you can check on the internet and read them. And secondly, the second approach is a domestic politics approach in Indonesia. So the very often cited sentence in Indonesia foreign policy circle is that the foreign policy comes from home. So which means that domestic politics is the main determinant for Indonesia's foreign policy. And so a typical example of this approach is Pak Rizal Sukma's book on it's titled Indonesia-China, The Politics of a Troubled Relationship. So this book it stems from the logic of Indonesian domestic politics and explain why Indonesia wants to reach out to China and to reinstate their foreign policy in 1980s and 90s. And the third approach is an interactive approach. So in recent years, based on a lot of declassified diplomatic historical materials, so a few very excellent works have been produced discussing the history of the bilateral relations during the period of 1945-1965. And they use both the historical archives of Indonesia and China and compare these historical archives, and using an approach of dynamic and comprehensive comparison, and they can grasp a very complex situation of international environments and political changes inside of both China and Indonesia, and which determines the roots of interaction between China and Indonesia. And a very good work by Zhou Taomo, published in 2019, called Migration, A Time of Revolution, China, Indonesia, and Cold War, is a very good example of this approach. And she uses the declassified China's historical archives as the materials to write this book. And also Liu Hong's book called China and Shaping of Indonesia uses the similar approach. Right. So when we think about the relationship between two countries, in addition to the very universal dimensions like politics, security, trade, and commerce or society, so we also need to take into account the very peculiar or specific recurrent topics that often occur in discussing the bilateral relations. So these non-common issues have reoccurred in the history of interaction between the two countries and have had a profound and long-lasting impact. In 1968, Ruth McQuay proposed that Indonesian society understand China in three dimensions. That is a state, a revolution, and an ethnic minority. And similarly, Pak Rizal Sukma also echoes McVeigh's judgment when he suggests that the triangular threat which means that during the New Order era, so the triangular threat refers to China, the Communist Party of Indonesia, PKI, and also the overseas Chinese. So these are the sources of the negative attitudes of Indonesian elites at that time towards China during the New Order period. So this is to say that the Indonesian overseas issue and ideology issues factors are the two dimensions that cannot be ignored in distinguishing the Indonesian-Chinese relations from those between China and other countries' relations. And combining what we have discussed above, the three approaches, and also the recurring themes. So here I proposed a two theoretical approach, that's a two-level approach to analysis the bilateral relations. So the two-level means that the first level actually identifies the focus and main areas of Indonesia and China relations in a given period. So this is the first level to identify the focus and main issues, main areas of diplomatic relations. And the second level explains the form and in which specific diplomatic actions took place. For example, which kind of diplomatic tools were used to implement the foreign policy, and also the timing of the implementation of the foreign policy. So this is the two level. And I think, firstly, for the first level, the basic framework of the two countries stems from the intersection of China's policy towards Indonesia and Indonesia's policy towards China. And among them, China's policy towards Indonesia needs to be understood in the context of the overall thinking of China's diplomacy. So China's policy towards Indonesia is a derivative of China's overall foreign policy. And secondly, and the areas and the main topics in which Indonesia wishes to establish ties with China are highly influenced by the foreign pressure that Indonesia faces at a time and the international order. And on a second level, as to the after identifying the main areas and issues of relations between these two countries, for the concrete actions of the two countries to implement the goals of engagement, like the choice of diplomatic tools and the choice of the historical points and timings, are mainly influenced by the changing domestic politics of Indonesia. Specifically, I mean the solidity and composition of the ruling coalition in Indonesia that often limits the scope and timing of Indonesia's use of foreign policy tools. So on the first note, China's foreign policy on Indonesia is a derivative of its own diplomatic thinking. To trace back China's overall diplomatic thinking, we can divide it into at least four periods. The first period is from 1950s to 67. So China's foreign policy towards Indonesia, it should be discussed in the context of the middle ground policy of interaction with the neighboring nationalist countries. So in January of 1962, Mao Zedong proposed a saying that the socialist camp is one camp and the United States is another, and all the other countries are the middle ground. And in 1964, Mao Zedong further pointed out that China, Africa, and Latin America are the first middle ground, while Europe, North America, Canada, and Oceania are the second middle ground, and Japan also belongs to the second middle ground. So this theory of the middle ground defined the strategic objectives of China's diplomatic work. Firstly, China must strengthen its solidarity and cooperation with the vast number of oppressed and economically backward countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and resolutely oppose the war policy of imperialism. And secondly, China must continue to adhere to and strengthen its position of independence and autonomy, and oppose the control of any great power. Against this backdrop, China maintains relatively friendly political relations with Indonesia. And the second phase was from 1967 to 76. At this time, the relations between China and Indonesia were interrupted. So this attitude was a derivative of China's overall diplomatic thinking at this time, that is called attacking the U.S. at the same time, also attacking the Soviet Union from both sides. So which means that China was not in very good relations with U.S. and the Soviet Union at this time. So in fact, at this time, China's diplomacy was relatively isolated during this period, and against this backdrop, the relations with Indonesia was also temporarily frozen. So the third period was from 1976 to 89. So at this time, China and Indonesia's relation was not reinstated, but a little bit better than before. So China's attitude toward Indonesia at this time was subordinated to the policy of improving relations with the United States, and opposing the Soviet Union. During this period, so China began to establish diplomatic relations with a number of Southeast Asian countries, which were in good relations with America, and also in China's relations with Indonesia. And after the end of the Cold War, China began to establish a new type of interstate relations with neighboring countries based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and to develop all-round cooperation with Indonesia under the principle of good neighborhood and mutually beneficial cooperation. While at the same time, for Indonesia, China is a very special and a great power that needs to be tackled with caution. And its policy towards China can hardly be categorized into its East Asian policy, its Asia-Pacific policy, or any category system. So making Indonesia's policy towards China is a very self-independent and single-leveled. So how to analyze Indonesia's China policy? So Professor He Kai from Greenfields University has put forward the idea that Indonesia's foreign policy in the post-Cold War period was a response to the foreign pressure. So here, foreign pressure mainly refers to the pressure exerted on Indonesia by the United States. So the United States had played a very important role in major historical events that determined Indonesia's destiny, such as Indonesia's separation from Dutch control and the West Papua issue, and also the local insurgents of 1950s and the September 30th incident, and also the following purging of the PKI, and also the East Timor issue, and even the ouster of Suharto regime and the democratic reforms. So America was also the main provider of economic assistance to Indonesia during the New Order period. So, and in the post-Cold War period, especially after the democratic reforms of 1998, balancing and adapting to American pressure and demands has been a major task for Indonesia's foreign policymakers. It is against this backdrop that China has become Indonesia's partner in diffusing US pressure. On Indonesia's diplomatic spectrum, many of China's qualities are the very antithesis of those of Americans. So China's practice of non-interventionism is in stark contrast to US interference in its internal affairs by hoisting the banners of democracy and human rights. And China's foreign policy, China's foreign aid is not politically conditioned, whereas U.S. Foreign aid is often premised on political and economic reforms. And China's main interest in Southeast Asia after the reform and opening up has been to promote the economic and social development of both sides, while the United States has been its primary concern is security interest in the region. So in Indonesia's view, the China-Indonesian relationship and the United States-Indonesian relationship are mutually exclusive or kind of zero-sum friendship. So China is often seen by the Indonesians as a partner in relieving the US pressure. As for the implementation and the timing of China-Indonesia cooperation, and I think it is often constrained by Indonesian domestic politics. So under the premise that the basic framework and the developmental trend of relations between China and Indonesia are determined, as for the specific issues, policies, and measures or historical points of interaction between the two countries are often very flexible, and which is often related to the Indonesian government's ability to depose its foreign policy tools. The choice of diplomatic tools available to the policymakers in Indonesia is often limited by its domestic political system and its political structure. The elasticity of time frame for the realization of specific policy and actions towards China has been greater in Indonesia since the 1950s due to the three reconfigurations of the political system and also the frequent change of the government. In other words, in the process of implementing the basic development framework of relations between China and Indonesia, Indonesia often lacks the condition for rapid implementation, while China often waits and sometimes offers alternatives. In particular, the Indonesian government's ability to make extensive use of diplomatic tools is limited when the government is faced with an opposition coalition that has more seats in the DPR than in the ruling coalition, or when opponents have successfully organized social mobilization to challenge the ruling coalition. So in this case, I think this situation was amply reflected in the long process of communication between the two countries in the resumption of diplomatic relations between 78 to 89. So after briefly introducing the theoretical framework, I will give a very brief review of China-Indonesian diplomatic relations. So the first period is called the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial political partners. That was between 1950s to 1965. So at the beginning of the Cold War, Indonesia faced very heavy foreign intervention and systematic pressure. On the one hand, the United States, fearing the realization of the domino theory in Indonesia, stepped up this direct intervention in Indonesia. On the other hand, the systematic pressure of the US-Soviet struggle to supremacy was reflected in the sharp ideological and partisan rivalries within Indonesia. So under the double pressure, the Indonesian government, on the one hand, opposed Western intervention in the Indonesian national liberation movement, and on the other hand, pursued an independent and active diplomatic line, not following either side of the USSR or America. And Indonesia has established extensive diplomatic relations with emerging nation states, including China, in order to gain more international support. And for the Chinese side, in the early 1950s, the United States adopted a policy of isolation against New China, and breaking through the United strategic encirclement of China was an important task for Chinese diplomacy. So in these relations with the emerging nation states, China relied on the middle ground line to broadly unite emerging nationalist countries. Thus, the political consensus of opposing Western interference and supporting emerging nationalist countries independently, resolving the issues of sovereignty and national liberation, established the basis of the development of friendly relations between China and Indonesia, and also with other developing countries. And this is the main element of mutual support. So on April 13 of 1950, China and Indonesia established diplomatic relations, and interactions were infrequent at the first place. But with the Bandung Conference as a turning point, China and Indonesia began high-level interactions and initial economic and social exchanges. At the time of 1955, when the Asia-Africa Conference took place in Bandung, Premier Zhou Enlai elaborated the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the position of seeking common ground while resolving differences, so which won the appreciation of Indonesia and other Asian, African, and Latin American countries. During the conference, Zhou Enlai also signed a treaty with Indonesia to resolve the issue of dual citizenship for overseas Chinese in Indonesia. In this attempt to eliminate Indonesia's worries about the Chinese overseas interference in Indonesia's internal affairs through overseas Chinese, and to show that Chinese political support for the Indonesian government. And after the Bandung Conference, the two countries opened high-level visits to each other and gradually voiced mutual support in the international political arena. Bilateral relations also prospered in terms of trade, and trade expanded rapidly. In 1958, the bilateral trade amounted to more than $75 million, and in 1959, only a year later, it increased more than $111 million. Since 1954, China has invited a large number of Indonesian intellectuals and cultural groups to visit China, and they visit the Communist Party of China, changed the life of Chinese people, and also they witnessed the land reform, a lot of other reform policies, and which influenced a lot the domestic policies of Indonesia. And in 1958 to 1959, both China's foreign policy and the international situation facing Indonesia have changed. So bringing the political partnership between the two countries very closer. On the one hand, the shift in China's foreign policy towards the World Revolution in 1958, China started a two-front attack on the United States and the Soviet Union, so made solidarity with emerging nationalist countries, including Indonesia, even more important to China. And China's political support for Indonesia was strengthened when they saw Indonesia had suppressed a local insurgency backed by the United States. And on the other hand, British and American interventionist pressure Indonesia continued to grow, which with covert support for like Bermuda and BRRI, local insurgencies. So against this backdrop, Indonesia moved closer to China for three reasons. The first reason is that China supported Indonesia's liberation and opposed U.S. intervention in internal affairs. The second reason was that President Sukarno relied on the Communist Party of Indonesia, or PKI, to counterbalance the pro-America military factions, and the PKI served as a bridge to connect Indonesia and China. And the third reason was that China has changed its one-sided policy to lean toward the Soviet Union, and Chinese foreign policy at that time became closer to Indonesia's bebas active foreign policy principles. So China and Indonesia had very similar response to the new international situation, and this brought them closer together. So Chinese-Indonesian political ties were very close between 1959 to 1965. Some high-level visits were very frequent, like President Sukarno visited China twice in 1961 and 1964. And the Chinese President Liu Shaoqi visited Indonesia in 1964, and Premier Zhou Enlai visited Indonesia in 1965, and Foreign Minister Chen Yi visited Indonesia in 61 and also 65. And from the economic side, from 1958 to 65, China assisted Indonesia with a $215 million US, which topped China's assistance to Asian and African nationalist countries at that time. And by 1965, China has become Indonesia's second largest trading partner. And in 1961, this year saw the signing of a treaty of friendship and an agreement on cultural cooperation between China and Indonesia. And many Indonesian literary and artistic works made their way to China. So the folk songs like Sing Sing So and Bonggawai Solo are being widely sung in China. And even today, a lot of Chinese people in their middle age or the senior Chinese citizens, they can sing these Indonesian folk songs. They are very familiar to them. During the 1966 to 89, the bilateral relations between China and Indonesia was frozen, and then gradually they started to re-engage. So after the September 30th incidents in 1965, the relationship between China and Indonesia took a sharp turn for worse. And in 1960 and during 1967 to 76, the relationship between the two countries was disrupted, and their attitudes towards each other were more negative than before. But from the early 70s, there was a change when China proposed to unite with the United States against the Soviet Union and started to establish diplomatic relations with United States in 1979. The easing tensions between China and the United States resolved external pressures for the resumption of diplomatic relations between China and Indonesia. And also, China established diplomatic relations a lot of Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, and also started to re-engage with Singapore. So this situation was really beneficial for the re-engagement of China and Indonesia. And since 1979, China has also shifted its focus of development to socialist modernization and put forward the theme of peace and development, as well as its peaceful foreign policy of non-alignment and independence. As China continued to send friendly signals to Indonesia, the relations began to loosen. So China took the opportunity of participation in the commemoration of the 1980s and 1985 Bandung Conference to express China's willingness to resume diplomatic relations with Indonesia on the basis of Bandung spirit and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And in the 1980s, the Suharto government shifted also from the ideological legitimacy of anti-communism to the legitimacy of the economic performance in order to break through the European and American trade protectionism, to expand export markets, and to reduce dependence on Japan. So the Suharto government started to try to develop direct trade relations with China. And in the March 11th of 1978, President Suharto openly stated to the MBR that he was ready to resume diplomatic relations with China. But the resumption of diplomatic relations between China and Indonesia took more than 10 years. Why was that? So the reason that it took more than a decade from the expression of the two countries' willingness to resume diplomatic relations to the final normalization of relations was that the Indonesian government faced a lot of domestic resistance. So elites such as the military and the Islamic groups still viewed China as a threat and had fourfold of concerns about China. So firstly, they fear that to re-engage with China would followed by a resurgence of PKI and communism in Indonesia. And secondly, they fear that the impact on the Indonesian economy. So the political and business elites in Indonesia fear that the trade with China will impact domestic industry, and then China will use the Chinese capital to control the Indonesian economy. And thirdly, they fear that the Chinese overseas still hold allegiance to China, and the military and the security services suspected that the Chinese Indonesians maintain their political loyalty to China. And finally, the elites worry that China's strategic intentions in Southeast Asia, especially the military, sees China's claims to South China Sea in the late 90s as a threat to Indonesia's maritime borders, and they are reluctant to engage with China. However, the Indonesian Foreign Ministry believe that it is precisely because of the uncertainty about China's intentions that Indonesia needs to engage with China and use the multilateral mechanisms to restrain China. So because of the domestic resistance, President Suharto could only advance relations with China in the insensitive area of trade and commerce first, and the two countries resumed direct trade in 1985. And finally, in February 1989, President Suharto and Chinese Foreign Minister Qian Jichen met in Tokyo and agreed on the principle of resumption of diplomatic relations, which were finally resumed on 1998 on August 8th between the two countries. And the third period is called the multilateral cooperation led by economy and trade. It is between the 1990s and 2004. So since the end of 1980s, in the face of the disintegration of the bipolar pattern and the Western sanctions against China, Deng Xiaoping has proposed the diplomatic policy of conceal one's ability and bide one's time. This foreign policy advocated an all-round and hostile-free diplomacy, which is very similar to the Indonesian foreign policy during SBA, like 1,000 friends and zero enemy. And also China upgraded the status of third world countries such as Indonesia in China's external strategy. In addition, China's all-round diplomacy places particular emphasis on participation in multilateral international organizations. Against this policy backdrop, China hopes to develop friendly relations with Indonesia and increase the contacts in multilateral organizations. While at the same time, Indonesia also prefers to reach out to China on a multilateral platform rather than a bilateral platform. On the one hand, this reflects the fact that Indonesia's trust in China still needs to be improved. And on the other hand, it is because President Suharto intended to make a difference in the new arena of international politics in the post-Cold War era. And international issues of concern to Indonesia, such as the Vietnam-Cambodia conflict and the ban on nuclear weapons testing and opposition to the U.S. human rights pressure, and also the establishment of a new type of North-South relationship, and also the promotion of South-South cooperation. All these discussions and issues were on the basis of multilateral platforms such as United Nations, ASEAN, and non-aligned movement, and APEC. So Indonesia hoped that China could lend support to Indonesia on these platforms. So during this period, China and Indonesia cooperated more than the multilateral platforms, such as Indonesia's support for China's reinstatement to GATT or the WTO, Indonesia's support for China's position in the resolution of Tibet at the UN Conference on Human Rights, and also Indonesia supported the admission of China as an observer state in 1992, when Indonesia was the chairman in office of the non-aligned movement. And China was also invited to participate in ASEAN regional forums. And Indonesia admitted China as a full-fledged ASEAN dialogue partner country during its chairmanship in 1996. And China held its first summit meeting with ASEAN and participated in the first ASEAN 10+3 leaders informal meeting in 1997. And during this period, the most important achievement of bilateral relations was in the area of trade and commerce. During the period of 1987 to 1998, Indonesia's export to China averaged $1.217 billion annually, making China Indonesia's fifth largest export trading partner. And when it came to the Asian financial crisis, after this the crisis landed in Indonesia, Indonesia has accepted a total of $15 billion loan from the international financial institutions, with very strict political conditions dedicated to change its to reform its policy, to reform its politics and economic structure. So at that time, Indonesia's foreign policies, its main objective was to find resources to repay the aid and also to revitalize the economy as quickly as possible, and also to find political support to counterbalance the Western world's interventions. So at that time, the United States criticized the human rights situation in Indonesia, and also it interfered in the jurisdiction in Malacca Straits. And Australia voiced its support for the independence of Timor-Leste, and at that time threatened the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Indonesia. But in contrast to the United States, China supported Indonesia in upholding its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and opposing interference and hegemony. And gradually, a consensus emerged among the Indonesian elites that they want to advance relations with China. They saw it as a way to constrain the U.S. hegemony. Thus, Indonesia's interactions with China during that period centered on two main lines of action. The first is to help Indonesia to counterbalance Western political pressure, and the second is to revive Indonesia's economy. In this period, the political relations between China and Indonesia are advancing on both bilateral and multilateral platforms. In the bilateral sphere, Indonesia has improved relations with China by reducing political discrimination against Chinese Indonesians. President Gus Dur contributed a lot to the restoration of Chinese rights and relations with China, and he designated China as its first official country to visit after his inauguration, and also lifted the ban of Chinese language in Indonesia. And also lifted the ban of Confucianism and Chinese New Year. Following by the President Megawati, she continued the line of friendship with China. And China was the first non-ASEAN country that she visited. And Megawati also supported the development of Chinese language education and Chinese studies and declared the Chinese New Year as a national public holiday. So at the same time, China has also repeatedly spoken out in support of Indonesia's defense of its territory and sovereignty, and against Western interference in Indonesia. So such as that in 2004, China spoke out against U.S. meddling in patrolling the Malacca Strait. And in May 2001, China's military foreign affairs issued a comment distancing itself from the Papuan separatists claiming to be backed by China. And during this period, China and Indonesia also signed a currency swap agreement between their central banks under the ASEAN 10+3 initiative in Chiang Mai, and China signed a Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia in 2003 during Indonesia's ASEAN presidency. And the fourth period is called the Comprehensive Cooperation with Strategic Partners. That's between 2005 and 2012. In this period, sorry? Everything all right?
Yeah, continue, Bu. Everything all right.
Okay. Oh, okay. In 2005, so China proposed the diplomatic policy of peaceful development, so which states that the big countries and the priority and neighboring countries are the key, and developing countries are the foundation. So as both the neighboring country and the developing country, Indonesia occupies a very important position in China's diplomatic policy. And in this period, Indonesia largely emerged from the Asian financial crisis and paid off its IMF debt ahead of schedule. So President SBA became the first directly elected president, and making a period of consolidation of Indonesian democracy. So at this time, Indonesia enjoyed a relatively relaxed international situation, and the pressure from the United States was lesser than before. So against this backdrop, Indonesia was relatively independently could pursue its foreign policy objective with China. So during this period, the two countries has elevated their relations to a strategic partnership, and Indonesia was the first to become a strategic partner with China among the ASEAN countries. And in the year 2011, China became Indonesia's largest trading partner. And in this time also, Indonesia was this time saw a rise of Chinese culture in Indonesia. So the Confucius Institute started to be established in Indonesia in 2007, And by the time 2011, there were another 6 Confucius Institutes established in Indonesia. So since the year 2013, the bilateral relations enters into the new era. In this year, the background is like this. Since the 2013, China put more importance to the neighboring diplomacy, including the relations with Indonesia. And in 2010, China became the second largest economy in the world. Because of Chinese transition in its international identity, the importance of the Southeast Asian countries become like more important for China in its foreign policy landscape. And in the year 2013, President Xi Jinping proposed the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road initiative in his speech in the Indonesian parliament. And also in the same year that Indonesia and China became the comprehensive strategic partner. And also in the year 2014, President Joko Widodo became the president, and at that time, Indonesia also faces a rather relaxed international situation. Although in 2 years later, Trump became the American president, and he began a hostile policy against China and proposed the Indo-China strategy. But Indonesia handled this tension with ease, together with other ASEAN countries. So ASEAN proposed the ASEAN version of Indo-Pacific and emphasized the centrality of ASEAN in leading the regional cooperation framework in Indo-Pacific. So under this international backdrop, so Indonesia's foreign policy towards China is still very independent. So Indonesia pursues a very pragmatic cooperation with China to obtain financial and production capacity support from China to address its domestic issues. The two countries became a comprehensive strategic partner in 2013, and it also realized the alignment of the BRI project and so the Global Maritime Forum in 2018. So there are 3 highlights of this relationship during this time. They are infrastructure cooperation, economic trade cooperation, also people-to-people exchanges. In terms of the infrastructure, in the year 2018 alone, Indonesia offered China with a list of 60 billion US dollars in infrastructure projects. And the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway is a landmark project in this infrastructure cooperation. And for the second phase of BRI cooperation, the integrated regional economic corridor in Indonesia is expected to be the second leading project, infrastructure projects in Indonesia. And also Indonesia's capital, the new capital relocation plan, the IKN, is also actively seeking support from the AIIB. In terms of the trade and economy, so bilateral trade increased from 57.3 billion in 2013 to 202.2 billion US dollars in 2019. Indonesia was once in a trade deficit. So let's see this. There's a chart. So this is the trade volume, and this is the export-import and deficit of Indonesia's trade with China. So before 2019, so Indonesia was predominantly in a deficit position, but after 2019, the Indonesian deficit changed rapidly, and the total imports and exports between the China and Indonesia are now basically balanced with a healthier trade structure. And and China has been Indonesia's largest trading partner during this period. And also the investment. So over the past 10 years, Chinese investment in Indonesia has been the biggest highlight of Belt and Road cooperation. And the Chinese FDI flow to Indonesia amounting to just 1.56 billion in 2013. And in 2022, so this number doubled. This number doubled from that in the year before that and reached the number of 8.23 billion in 2022. So the figure is not here, but it's much higher. It's 8.23 in 2022. And Indonesia is now the second largest destination for Chinese investment in ASEAN. Okay. So the final thing I want to talk about is what can we learn from the bilateral histories between China and Indonesia. So let me summarize a little bit what I taught in the beginning of this lecture. So I think that we should look at the specialty, the special character of China-Indonesia foreign policies in terms of the inseparability of interstate relations and overseas Chinese issues and ideology issues. I think these three issues that are interrelated and cannot be viewed separately. And secondly, I want to repeat the basic framework that to analyze the dynamics between China-Indonesia relations. So I think the basic framework of this bilateral relations between China and Indonesia is mostly determined by the intersection of China's foreign policy and Indonesia's policy toward China, among other things. I think the directions of China's policy towards Indonesia needs to be understood in the context of Chinese overall thinking and hierarchy of China's foreign policy. And Indonesia's foreign policy towards China were like much more kind of like a response to its foreign pressure and systematic pressures. And after the intersections are determined, the main themes and the priority of two countries' relations are determined, I think the specific action, the foreign policy tools, and also the timing and historical points in which that the foreign policy were implemented was largely determined by the Indonesian domestic politics. So which specifically means that the solidity and the breadth of the Indonesian's ruling coalition limits the scope and timing of Indonesia's use of its foreign policy tools. And there are two other takeaways from this lecture. So the first, I think, is both China and Indonesia are constantly trying to find a way to get along with each other over time. And they, as time goes, they are finding ways to make each other feel comfortable, and which includes not rushing into things, and they try to wait for the right moment. I think that is the wisdom that both China and Indonesia gained during their interactions over more than 70 years. And lastly, I think the stability and continuity of China's foreign policy is really important to the stable development of the two countries' relations. So China has to constantly adhere to its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in dealing with Indonesia. So looking back in the history and also looking forward into the future, I think only by implementing the neighborhood diplomacy of like treating neighbors with kindness and companionship, only by this can China and can Indonesia gradually let go of the historical misunderstandings of China in history.
Yeah.
And only in this way that the mutual trust between the two countries can be enhanced and deepened. So that's basically my takeaway and my sharing of my thoughts on the China-Indonesia relations. I think I don't know if you agree with me, but if you like you have other opinions or have questions, I'm very happy
Yeah,
to
yeah.
hear. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. Everyone, please give applause to Bu Song. Yeah. Bu Song, thank you so much for all the ideas, yeah, the point you shared to us. I think that you have raised some important points, yeah, in which I also had some experience, yeah, after almost 2 months living in China. Okay, if we live in Indonesia, where some of us we are relied so much on the media, we rely so much on the comments of some commentators, some scholars, yeah. Sometimes we cannot confirm directly to what exactly exists in China. I agree with you. There are some past misunderstanding, yeah. But sometimes this kind of issue become a regular, yeah, political commodity that affects, yeah, in to some extent, to the idea that the people's Indonesian people had. But yeah, after 1990s, and then the presence of Belt Road Initiative, it becomes increase and increase again. So I think that we need to keep this, between the two countries, to keep uh yeah, learning each other, sharing each other through the economic, for most importantly, so that both countries can get benefit from this relation. Okay, next we have Q&A session. We have 25 minutes, and I would like to also greet Pa Zahrul Anam and Bu Grace, our professor from International Relations Department. Maybe they want to, they have question later on, Bu. We got in one student raised his hand, and we have also questions in the chat room, Bu. Perhaps you can say it later. Uh, I will give a chance to Arshad first. Should we collect all the question, then you answer at the same time, Bu?
Uh,
Mau
uh, so
atau satu-satu?
I satu, I think. As I browse these questions, if I have the answer in mind, I'll just answer them immediately, probably. So the first one is,
Okay.
as China and Indonesia have good relations so far, do you think the politics post-election 2024 may affect the continuation of this? It's an interesting question. So I think the election next year, mainly it'll give a little bit adjustment to Indonesia's foreign policy, not just towards Indonesia, but maybe a adjustment to overall Indonesian foreign policy in general. And I think basically, I've now here Indonesia have three pairs of candidates, and they have already shared their foreign policy perspectives. I think last week or 2 weeks ago in CSIS, and I watched the YouTube, and I think they have shared a similar idea that they want to uphold the bebas aktif principle, and they follow the alignment non-block principle. So which side they're trying to stay equal distance between China and America. So which means that basically largely they are following the similar policy as they are now with China and Indonesia. And also considering the close relationship, especially the trade and economic relationship between China and Indonesia, I think the friendly relationship between these two countries will largely continue. So I think most scholars in China, they should agree with my judgment. So they are very optimistic about the Chinese-Indonesia relations, even after the election next year. But at the same time, I think there are still uncertainties. Of course, when the government changes, of course there will be slight changes in their policies. So as we see right now, there are emerging problems in many of the aspects in terms of Chinese investment in Indonesia, like the nickel industry, the labor industry, the labor issues, the South China Sea issue. I think these issues could be like roasted if politicians needs or in need during the campaigning. I think it is possible, but still, at the same time, I still trust the wisdom of Chinese and Indonesian decision makers. They know that a healthy relationship between China and Indonesia is beneficial to both countries, but beneficial to the regional peace and development, and also beneficial to the world. Yeah, that's my question.
you.
That's my answer.
Okay.
And the second, China investment in Indonesia has been largely focused on infrastructure. Does it also concern with knowledge transfer through training or capacity building? Oh, for sure. So I want to emphasize two things. The first thing is that for a lot of areas of investment in Indonesia, the law in Indonesia requires that for investors to transfer knowledge or do training. So this is a requirement, a mandatory requirement a Chinese investor has to follow. This is one thing. And the second thing is that as a lot of Chinese investors trying to build public engineering factories in Indonesia, especially the manufacturing sector, needs a lot of laborers, and they cannot meet this requirement by exporting laborers from China because it's too expensive. And the other hand, the Indonesian immigration does not allow so much Chinese laborers to come into Indonesia. So Chinese investor has to train the local Indonesian laborers to provide them with knowledge, with techniques to become competent as in competent human resources. So that I think this. So I think my simple answer to this question is yes. And I also want to add that the training or capacity building is still at the very start of its development, and it should be strengthened in the future. Yeah. The third, as you have mentioned in your PPT, investing in Indonesia is not easy as domestic politics regularly affects project implementation. Will this affect Chinese investment considering in the future? In my opinion, I think it really depends on which kind of industry the Chinese investor wants to invest. So this is a cost versus benefit calculation. So for example, if you are a factory that you make shoes for Adidas, probably between Indonesia, Vietnam, and Laos, what you want is just like human labor who can make shoes. If Indonesia is hard to enter, probably you could switch to Vietnam or switch to Laos. So this is so such kind of industry is very interchangeable. Is not very hard to, and it's not very hard to switch to other countries. But in terms of other industries like downstream industrialization, the nickel smelters like this, only Indonesia has this very rich natural resources that the Indonesian own wealth, while other countries do not have these special capitals, economic features. So that no matter how hard it is for Chinese investors to invest in Indonesia, they still have to if they want to build their factories. Right. So I think it's just basically a cost benefits calculation, right?
Yeah.
And one other thing, I think, despite that, Indonesian politics is very how to say, fluid and easy to change. But I think the good thing is that the Indonesian government is good at listening. I think they are very sensitive about investor sentiments. So and they are quite good at collecting opinions before they issue something legal, issue something very formal. So I think this is a good side of Indonesian politics or Indonesian politicians. They listen and they want to collect opinions before they finally make up the law or other like peraturan. So I think it's a good thing. It's a good channel. They still leave a channel for communication. Yeah. And fourth question, how China debunks Western accusation about One Belt, One Road project and the debt trap. I think, yeah, you raised a very important question. Really, since the Belt and Road Initiative proposed in 2013, I think the Western has been criticizing this initiative from many aspects, like the debt trap, like the environmental problems, the like labor problems, and a lot more. I think I think what is lacked in China is that the Chinese tend to do a lot, but speak very little. Yeah, actually, the Belt and Road Initiative, they have brought a lot of financial support and a lot of infrastructures, good investment to Indonesia, but maybe because the language problem or like the China's less control of their media. So Chinese tend not to speak a lot about what we have done here, what we have brought to Indonesia. So you hear very little positive words about Belt and Road projects, but I think it's what China lacks right now. The soft power is what we lack, is one thing. And as to the debt trap, I think I want to point out that the debt trap is a very, how to say, its standing ground is not solidified. If you look at the debt trap reports, that they do not show very precise or reliable data on how like Indonesia how much money Indonesia owe China. They never show like data like this. Maybe they give estimation, but it's a wild guess. But I think I previously read an Indonesian news, which is they gave precise data. It's from the Kementerian Keuangan that exactly how much Indonesian government have loan from China. And this is a precise figure. And if you could check that news, if later I could browse it and send a link to you, you could see that there is like Chinese government, Indonesian government debt to China was less than 1/10 of its total debt to foreign countries. So it's a very small number. So I think this debt trap is very, very unreliable accusation. Yeah. Later I'll find the link. I'll send to Barry and then share to you. Yes. Okay. Okay, the fifth question. Despite China's effort to help countries by funding and development, do you think that China also has political ambitions in the region? Where China puts its money, political ambitions in the region? Political ambitions. I'm not sure about what kind of political ambition is that. I think China's political ambition in the region, its main concern is the regional peace and prosperity, especially peace is very important for China right now. So especially under this China-US strategic rivalry situation, I think a very peaceful peace on condition for China to continue to develop is really, really important. And if there's any political ambitions, I think that is the sole ambition for China in this region. Yes, to build peace and prosperity with their neighbor countries. Yes. And if you fear that there's China's want to expand itself in the region, please don't. So if you can check there's a newly released white paper by the Chinese government in this October. It is the Chinese white paper on this neighborhood diplomacy, and in that paper, Chinese government solidly claim that China will never expand, will never become a hegemon. So that is written in letters. You could read that paper online.
Mm, mm, mm.
In the BRICS organization, what we know is that the main goal of BRICS is to increase their economic and political influence at a global level. This group often gathers to discuss economic, trade, financial, and foreign policy issues. BRICS has also tried to create its own financial institution, such as the New Development Bank, which was founded in 2014, as a third of traditional financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The question is whether China will become a superpower in the future in the country's economy. I think China now is the second largest economy in the world, and of course, it is for every country to aspire to develop better. As I said before, a superpower is different with a hegemon. I think China probably
Yeah.
wants to become a superpower, right? Every country wants to, but a superpower does not equal to a hegemon. Probably
Okay.
we should distinguish these two concepts and do not add additional like negative meaning to
Sense
the word
in
superpower
sense.
itself. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
And
that's basically
we have one
questions.
one student that raised his question. Arsad, you want to say something?
Yes, sir. So, I'm Arshad from class G. So the question is, as we know that the G2G relations between Indonesia and China has been a lot of, I would say, a lot of timelines. As we know that it was frozen at it, maybe especially after the PKI case, right? But it's it went back by Suharto in the goal for economic development. However, the impression of the people of Indonesia still have such a not good impression to China. Maybe because of like communist things or something else, especially maybe because it has like a different uh, say ideology between Indonesia and China, which the majority, while Indonesia is majority Muslim and China is maybe we can there are also a lot of Muslim minorities in China, but maybe the image is like a communist or something like that. So how far Chinese government build a good impression to Indonesia or maybe to international world that how friendly China with the religious people or maybe with especially the Indonesian Muslims towards China. Yeah, so two things. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I get the question correctly because the sound was a little bit unclear right now. Do you mean your question is how will Chinese government to improve China on Muslims?
Yeah, so Muslims are also like the people in Indonesia, since a lot of people still have like a bad impressions maybe with China. Yeah.
Yes. It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
I think in recent years, in recent decade, China has been given a lot of emphasis and also support to enhance people-to-people exchanges from all aspects of civil society, like what we do with UMA, like to foster the academic exchanges and do joint research. And in universities, we established a lot of alliances with Indonesian think tanks. And if you look and if you read the news, there are a lot of Chinese delegations from the different municipal governments, from the trade, from the businessmen, universities, education, religious. There are all kinds of groups coming to Indonesia. There's a vibrant interaction between China and Indonesia society. I think this is what Chinese government has been doing recently. And in terms of ideology, I think China last year has put forward a new initiative called Global Civilization Initiative. So this initiative especially emphasizes to support the Asian culture or Asian mindset, which is to emphasize the idea of consensus, negotiation, and pluralism, and tolerance. So these are what all the Chinese call the Eastern country or the Asian culture. I think in this way, China is trying to propose something that could gather people together, especially in Asian countries, that we could understand each other from a more on a plural basis. Yes, that's what we think. Instead of trying to export communist or socialist ideology, China do not do that anymore. There is a more advanced ideology than that. Yeah.
I think I can add something, Bu. So the ideas that Mas Arsad says, it's actually reflect, some people Indonesian thinks about, China, the concern. It's actually the heritage of the, it mix, heritage of the PKI mixed with the political interest, so it makes the people, sometimes link this, the PKI anti-Islam and so on and so forth. But Arsad, I've been living for 2 months in here. I visited 7 mosques in here, and the people, of Islam, they are happy. They can pray, And in fact, the idea of the communism in here, Indonesia, Ibu, is much more negative in negative sense than the positive one. But when I had a conversation with Bu Vero, the CSIS scholars in here, you can see that the efforts of the government to support the UMKM, to support the business in here is very, very, is very big. And they don't let, one single company become very dominant. So they want it to be, distributed among the people, among the business, so that all of them can be, can get the economics, profit, they can enjoy the development. So that what I can learn from China, with the high techs, of course there are pros and cons. But after I live in here, then I can see, then I can witness, the attitude, even for us as Islam, we need to learn, from their efforts, from the hardworking, attitude, so that we can also develop our country. So I think the question from, sorry, Bu, you want to say something? No, okay. So I think Ibu is 3 minutes left. I think the question from Mars Arshad is the final question. Once again, I would like to say my, very my big thanks to all your efforts to prepare the presentations, to share to our students. So again, this will give them another perspective, about the current relationship between Indonesia and China. And also you have already mentioned or answered a couple of questions that they have raised. Yeah, it's genuine from the students, Ibu. So hopefully it will change, couple of ideas that they had and can motivate them to learn Mandarin. We got Mandarin in here, Mandarin class. So they can also have an idea to go for scholarship, yeah, to go to Fudan and other university in China. We hope, yeah, in the future. So
Yeah.
again, thank you so much for today's class, Ibu. Yeah.
Thank you so
Good
much.
luck for
Yeah.
your future. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye, Ibu.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you adik-adik semua. Thank you Bu Grace. Thank you Pak Zahrul.
Thank you, Pak.
Okay.